Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Today we are talking with Daniel McCarthy about the policy and politics of a new conservative agenda. A New Conservative Agenda is the title of an essay that Daniel McCarthy recently wrote for the journal First Things. I'm glad to have him on the program. Dan McCarthy is the editor of Modern Age. He is the director of the Novak Journalism Fellowship, and he was also for a number of years the editor of the American Conservative. He's a serious writer and thinker, and I'm glad to welcome him into the program.
Thanks, Richard.
So, Dan, your essay, A New Conservative Agenda, has received a lot of commentary, thought, responses, and I thought it would be great to talk about it. Let me read to you a line you make. You write in the first paragraph of the essay, and we'll get your further elaboration. You say, quote, "From the Great Recession and loss of manufacturing jobs to perpetual war in the Islamic world and intensifying culture war at home, conservatism, as the GOP understood it over the last few decades, was not only not the answer to our woes, but was in many cases their cause. Thus our present moment. Post-Reagan conservative intellectuals soldier on in think tanks and on opinion pages, but conservative voters are abandoning the cause," end quote. So your thoughts, if I could get your what did you mean there exactly? I mean, it's very directly stated, but maybe some further commentary on that would be good.
Yeah, well, I think conservatives were very surprised by the Donald Trump phenomenon in 2016. I was surprised myself. Republican voters, given a choice of many varieties of movement conservative within the Republican primaries, ranging from Ted Cruz to Jeb Bush to Marco Rubio. You had reform conservatives, you had Rand Paul representing libertarianism, you had a wide range of variations on conservatism, and yet Republican voters that year chose to support Donald Trump, who in many ways was the least orthodox of any of the conservatives on stage. At times, Trump made a point of saying he wasn't a conservative, made a point of saying, this was the Republican Party, not the Conservative Party. So I think that indicated the degree of slippage that conservatism as a philosophy or as an ideology had upon the minds of Republican voters. That the voters had looked at sort of the performance of economic conservatives like Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan in 2012. They'd looked at the sort of lack of success that had characterized the end of the Bush administration a few years before that. Bush had defined himself as a compassionate conservative. And I think voters said they were sort of sick of all of these options, and they wanted something very different and in some ways radically new.
Well, I think there were any number of instances in the 2016 Republican primary campaign and then in the general election where one thought Donald Trump had made statements that just ruled him out from contention, ruled him out from winning. And there was a moment in one of the Republican debates, I forget which state it was in, but there were like whatever, a dozen debates. Donald Trump makes the statement that the Iraq War was a complete mistake, a fiasco, and had just cost us immensely. And a lot of people thought that would rule him out from continuing. But he actually gained voters, it seemed. And he certainly had the applause of Republican voters in the room that night when he made that statement. That, to me, was sort of a signal that we were in a new world.
Yeah, Trump wound up giving voice to things that many Republicans had, in fact, already been thinking, but had not been telling the pollsters. It was like the emperor's new clothes. Donald Trump said things that everyone knew and everyone was sort of embarrassed to admit to. He said that, the Iraq War was something that the Bush family was sort of responsible for and that the country didn't feel good about. He said that the way our economic system had been going was not doing great things for middle America. He talked about immigration in a way that was more direct and forthright and, was really politically correct. And voters responded to all of that, not only in the Republican primaries, but also in the general election, to the absolute astonishment of pretty much everyone in Washington, D.C.
You were thinking also Donald Trump and his gestures and his rhetoric and the put downs and the insults, but also as the occasion for a lot of new thinking. And your your essay is a part of that. But before we get into your essay, when we say conservative, I mean, a thinker that you and I have both studied fairly closely, Wilmore Kendall, always insisted he was an American conservative. There had to be that qualifying term for conservatism to make sense. What does it mean right now to be a conservative in America? What should it mean?
Well, it's very open-ended right now. I think conservatism had become something of a formula in politics as of a few years ago, and really even within a great many of the magazines and think tanks of the right. It had become a formula that was characterized by, a degree of free market reformism towards the welfare state, a foreign policy that was characterized as fairly aggressive and in some ways idealistic or even Wilsonian, and a degree of social conservatism that was, sort of kind of strongly represented, I think, within the judiciary and by the kinds of judges that Republicans wanted to appoint, but it was in general not so strongly represented in terms of effective legislation or kind of winning any culture war battles. So conservatism had become a formula. And what Donald Trump did is to disrupt that and to, sort of encourage people to rethink what it meant. Now, for Wilmore Kendall, American conservatism basically meant a dedication to the American people and the spirit of their constitutionalism, which had to do not only with the written Constitution itself, but with the constitutional morality that the written Constitution embodied. That constitutional morality having to do with the way in which the popular mind and the popular spirit were modulated, sort of through the processes, through the different time frames of the different institutions within the Constitution, the kind of deliberation that would then give rise to, and the wisdom that would emerge from that deliberative process. Wilmore Kendall had a great deal of faith in the American people as what we would now say as kind of a populist force. And at times, Wilmore Kendall seemed at odds with some of his National Review colleagues because he was not, sort of a free market fundamentalist. He was, in fact, willing to go with the flow if the American people decided they wanted to, create some sort of social program, or if they decided to do something that, was not in keeping with the thought of Milton Friedman or Ludwig von Mises.
Yeah, provided that the Republican institutions were working. And there was
That's
that,
right.
there was that sort of process. Yeah, exactly. No, but also too, more generally, Wilmore Kendall, I'm an American conservative, and he means to defend, when he's talking about conservatism, the achievements of our constitutional order, of our union, of our citizenship, and was not caught up, I think that's what you were alluding to, in sort of abstractions or theoretical parts that many conservative thinkers had endorsed. I mean, he was much more brass tacks, to use a phrase.
That's true, but he was, a highly theoretical thinker himself. But you're correct that his idea of conservatism was not a checklist. It was not something that was, an abstract program to be achieved. Yeah. It was rather about a character of the American people and the Republican institutions that they had established. Yeah. And it was a character that also bore a relationship with the transcendent and with God. And that was something also that was, Kendall becomes a Roman Catholic, but actually his original Protestantism, his father had been a preacher. His Protestantism, I think, was kind of fundamental to his outlook on the American people, because he had this idea that, it was almost like a large, national congregation in some ways, which had, a certain, felt a vocation among itself, and felt that it had the ability to be a kind of self-governing congregation, a self-governing body under God. And he traced the sort of historical evolution of that kind of Americanism through, a number of basic charters of American liberty, not just the Constitution, but also a number of the colonial charters as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, I mentioned that only because as we move forward as conservatives in all of our arguments and disagreements, it seems to me Wilmore Kendall's thinking should be a part of that conversation. I would argue in a foundational way. So let's talk about the essay. What is the new conservative agenda?
Well, I make a case that conservatives need to develop an economic vision, and I give some examples from American history of the kinds of economic visions that successful statesmen have had in the past. Obviously, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson fought over different visions of industrialism and, sort of, in some ways, government bounties for fostering industrialism versus the Jeffersonian ideal of, kind of the yeoman agrarian citizen. You had the Whig and ultimately the sort of Republican vision, which was also identified by sort of the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, in terms of sort of American citizens who were free men and who could rise up economically and who had government creating institutional contexts and in economic contexts in which rising was possible. And then all the way through to the late 20th century, where Ronald Reagan had a very clear economic vision that was distinct from the Keynesianism that had existed before. And Ronald Reagan had a vision of entrepreneurship and deregulation that would create a sort of a technological boom and a boom of innovation that would be wonderful for the American middle class. And indeed it was. So right now, I think conservatives have lost a sense of having an economic vision or a story, and instead they've sort of defaulted to trying to rely on older narratives, particularly the narrative that Ronald Reagan had in the late 1980s. And that isn't quite sufficient now, because the rise of China has introduced an economic factor that was not present in the 1980s. It's a factor that is, sort of competing with us in a way that is, sort of very detrimental for our industries. And that's having, sort of terrible consequences for the American middle class, which is starting to shrink. So what I propose instead is a new conservative agenda, a new vision, which involves, sort of making citizens, once again, the focal point of, not just conservative policy, but of a sort of policy of government, a vision of government, and a vision of the economy. So that means having a degree of industrial protection and industrial policy in order to give our industries a kind of equal footing with those of, sort of the state-owned enterprises of China and others who are competing against us on an unlevel playing field. And it also means addressing the sort of wage and other problems created by sort of mass immigration, and saying that, the American workforce, the American labor pool comes first, the American citizen comes first, and the profits of people who want to hire sort of low-skill new workers, sort of new arrivals into America, that's something that is very much, sort of secondary if to be tolerated at all.
So thinking about your argument here in particular, so if in a key part of it, and you said this is the middle class is in decline. That's your statement. How do we know that to be true? Why, when you say the middle class is in decline, what are you relying on?
Well, there are various talking points that libertarians and others have put out there regarding what the statistical decline of the
there's a lot.
class.
There's a lot of talking points. I mean, I always try and suss out, how does one even begin to move through all the data? I tend to rely on George Borjas, on immigration and wages in terms of someone I look to have the best social science data. But go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, there are numbers aplenty, and you can tell a lot of different stories based on what numbers you're using. There is a definition, in terms of, I forget what the numbers actually are, but there is a sort of official government definition of what the middle class is. And, if you look at those numbers over the course of about a half century, from the late 1960s or early 1970s, you actually see kind of a promising and encouraging story, because the middle class designation within, the federal numbers has declined as a percentage of the American population, but it's declined because more people have gone into the upper income brackets as opposed to, and then some people have gone into the lower bracket, but more people have overall left the middle class and gone into the higher classes, which seems great. That seems like, exactly what you want to see. And so the decline of the middle class in that regard doesn't seem like such a big problem. Unfortunately, if you look at these very same official statistics, which are often cited by, sort of defenders of the economy as we have it today, as showing that everything is hunky-dory, if you look at the numbers starting in 2000 as opposed to starting back in the late 60s or early 70s, you see that the story is actually very different because I think it's about 3 percentage points of decline in the middle class since the year 2000, and it's about evenly split between people who've risen and people who've fallen. I think it may be slightly tilted in the direction of people who've fallen behind. So that's one thing that sort of gives rise to a point of concern. First of all, it's not really the case that everyone is moving from the middle class into the upper brackets. Second, there is a case to be made that even if there's something encouraging about having people moving into the upper bracket, which there is, nevertheless, you really do need a middle if you're going to have a relatively healthy class structure. If you just have, people who are quite wealthy, relatively speaking, and people who are quite poor, relatively speaking, if you have a higher degree of inequality, that may have political repercussions in terms of instability and dissatisfaction, and it may create a kind of stratified class division over time. And then finally, one of the things I mentioned in the essay is that even the people who have moved into higher income brackets are not necessarily as well-to-do as you might think, because increasingly we see that people are moving into cities. They're moving into cities that tend to be quite costly, like New York and Washington, D.C. and San Francisco, where even if you are nominally in one of the higher income brackets nationwide, earning a six-figure salary in New York or in San Francisco or in D.C. Is not necessarily 100% solidly middle class, depending upon what kind of housing you have, what kind of jobs you have, et cetera. So I think the economic pain that the American people have said that they are feeling is probably a real thing, and that attempts to sort of dismiss it as a statistical artifact or as people not being aware of the more happy statistics is probably incorrect, and is sort of like being an ostrich and sticking your head in the sand.
Well, I guess I try and see it both ways. In a way, and that's the response that I wrote to your essay. I was trying to give credence to both sides, because I think I can see it working with my own eyes, but also in my experiences of people experiencing this crunch that you're describing. I will say, before we went on air, I looked at the income quintile distribution. Pretty rough, distribution of incomes in America. It does seem there is still a bell curve, by and large, in our income. Well, over 40%, I think, are making somewhere between 40 households in America are making somewhere between 40 and 90,000 a year, which seems an income that can, get you by in most places. Maybe not San Francisco, or maybe not New York, but that's also the result of really bad state, local government policies. What do you say?
Well, state and local government policies and federal government policies all certainly contribute to the economic challenges that Americans are facing. So, one of the problems with the American middle class right now is that in order to be middle class, first of all, you have to send your children into higher education. The costs of higher education, of course, have famously spiraled completely out of control. That's largely as a result of the sort of price structure that has been deformed by government subsidies, by government loans, and by the growth of administrators within the university system. It's not faculty who are suddenly making lots and lots of money because of tuition going up. It's rather the administrative class within education has grown. You can also look at the cost of healthcare, which is something that is important not just for the middle class, but for everyone. That too has spiraled completely out of control as a result of some very bad government policies that unfortunately look like they're not going to be really rolled back. I'm not just talking about Obamacare, but in general, the fact that the federal government is so involved in setting prices for so many different kinds of medical services has a distorting effect across the board. And then, of course, there's real estate, which sort of goes through booms and busts, and that too is a market that is distorted by a lot of the financial incentives that government provides. So it's by no means simply a free market failure that has led to America facing challenges for the middle class. In fact, it's really not mostly driven by anything resembling a free market. It's driven by these goods that are totally warped in terms of their prices by government policy, and it's also driven, of course, by something which is also not a free market phenomenon, and that is by state policy in Beijing.
Yeah. No, I mean, but specifically on the bell curve. I mean, I still see a pretty solid middle class when I look at the income distribution.
It's the change to the middle class that's disturbing. So
no, I totally.
It's going to take time for that to
Yeah. Go ahead.
The direction of change is not promising. Let's put it that way.
Do we see income mobility up from lower quintiles or lower sections of income? Do we see them moving into the middle class? Because you talked about a drop off, but doesn't it also work the other way as well?
There's still mobility, yes.
Yeah.
Mobility has declined. Again, the direction of the change is not so encouraging. And that's one of the things that people, conservatives across the board are concerned about. I think you see this with people like Orrin Cass. I think you see it with any number of sort of other people who've written recent books. My friend Frank Buckley, for example. Now, what exactly is going to restore mobility or, sort of make it more effective, make it more fluid is a formula that a lot of people are trying to grope for and come up with. And it seems to me that, creative thinking is required here.
So you said in your first answer in thinking about a new conservative agenda that it would require an industrial policy of some kind. So I think maybe that's something worth exploring. It's just the means Dan McCarthy envisions employing policy-wise to shore up or expand a middle class.
Yeah, sort of industrial employment has been the heart of the American middle class for a very long time. It has not been, the largest single. There were times when it actually was the pretty much the largest single employer. It depends on how you want to slice up, the service sector as a whole, or slice things up by smaller subdivisions.
So the early 1950s. Industrial jobs were the height in America. From
that's
everything
right.
I've
Yeah.
read.
So there are going to be sort of inevitable changes to that degree of industrial employment. Partly, in fact, largely brought about by technology, but not entirely brought about by technology. We've seen countries that are just as high tech in terms of their industrial processes as the United States, who've been able to hold on to significantly more of their manufacturing employment. So in the United States, manufacturing employment is about 8% right now. In Japan, I think it's about 12%. And in Germany, it's actually 20%. Now, that's not to say that we can simply duplicate things that Japan or Germany have done, but it does tell us that technology by itself doesn't inevitably mean that 8% is the number you have to settle on. So it seems to me that, whatever can be done in order to make sure that the American middle class is fortified through the maintenance of what industrial jobs we can maintain and that actually are useful and productive should be undertaken. And I think it's worth noting that, world markets are growing. There are more people buying more goods than ever before all around the world. And the United States, there's no reason why we can't serve those markets to a greater degree, why we can't produce more goods that people around the world want to buy. And in some cases, that means we have to adopt, a pretty strong approach to getting other countries that are effectively protecting their markets to open their markets and let our goods come in. You kind of see that right now with the renegotiated NAFTA agreement. I keep forgetting the initials, AMCA. Which is, opening the Canadian dairy markets. So that's one sort of increase actually in sort of market penetration and even
which
free
is
trade.
its own incredibly protected market.
I'm sorry?
That's an incredibly protected market by Canadian.
Yes, it historically has been, and now it's going to be, sort of opened thanks to this renegotiated trade deal.
So you said, more people than ever buying goods and services, but that would also be because of the general insistence on global free trade in the post-Cold War period. I mean, that's a part of that, I think, at a minimum. I guess as I'm listening, I'm thinking, well, okay, so how does one, if industrial jobs are 10% in America, and it's been declining every year, but yet we also have this curious statistic, which I know you're aware of, the productivity of our manufacturing sector, very high. And I think recently it was at its all-time high. So, but that's a result of automation, not necessarily trade. So what do we do with that? Should we stop automating, or how should we kind of?
Oh, come on! That's a silly question. I think you know that. No, look, the absolute productivity in terms of how it is statistically measured is indeed at an all-time high. Although productivity growth, and you have to kind of look at different segments of manufacturing, but productivity growth is actually somewhat troubled. So, we start from an extremely great lead with respect to the rest of the world. And we're able to maintain that lead but we're sort of falling back over time. So right now, we're at an all-time high. The question is, where do we go in 20 years' time? Does American manufacturing productivity keep up, or is it, sort of pace going to slow down and eventually start declining? So that's where the concern here goes. No, you don't want to, be alarmed by technological productivity, although you do have to think about the consequences for politics. If people are being thrown out of work as a result of technology, that may not be something you can change. That may be something that simply has to be accommodated. But at the same time, the dislocations that creates in politics are things that one can't be oblivious to. And, I don't like the idea that the only solution to that kind of, difficulty is the expansion of the welfare state, or the creation of, sort of job training programs that may in fact be rather ineffective. I know there's dispute about how effective, some job retraining programs actually are, but I'm very skeptical of those kinds of interventions by the state. It seems to me that the better approach is to take, the unfair trade practices that places like China, which is, sort of the major manufacturing power now, or the major sort of rise in manufacturing power. It's, there are different ways to measure this. Their purchasing power parity manufacturing output is actually, more than double ours, but there are other ways of measuring, sort of output that are more favorable to us. In any event, China is the big question here. They obviously have a lot of policies that are not simply, that are not at all free market. And giving our industries a more competitive footing vis-a-vis the Chinese makes that keeps some of the jobs that would be lost to China from being lost, and that's a way of addressing and limiting the loss of jobs. You don't want to just concede everything technological and therefore lose as well the jobs to unfair competition. You want to keep the jobs that would be lost by unfair competition, even if you will necessarily or pretty much inevitably lose the technological jobs.
Yeah, I mean, with China, one question that comes to mind, obviously the forced technological transfers, which are in many ways being used, or can or will be used against us in the future by their military if we continue this route. It seems to me also with China, there's something David Goldman has pointed out, and he's written a lot on the idea of an industrial policy and relationships between China and America and trade. Just the idea of things that we did during the Cold War, of innovation, of technological improvements, of being able to actually outdo your opponent, such that, if you think about just the famous turning point in the Cold War, I think it was 1982, Israeli jets using American computer technology destroyed MiG jets being flown by the Syrians. And then this was sort of a bell in the night, like, oh my gosh, things have really changed technologically between these two powers. And so in a way, you think about things were going on with China near its shore and the tremendous investment it's made in its Navy and its defense forces there. What if you could outdo it in a couple of years with capital investment and all the sort of business you can do with technology? It wouldn't really matter because you've outdone them. And then that would have immediate consequences for trade, for investment manufacturing in the domestic peaceful world. So is that part of your prescription, or are you talking about something else when you say industrial policy?
Well, right now, China is racing ahead of us in a lot of the key technological sectors for, the next decade of the 21st century here. So, you've probably been following the headlines. You know that with 5G wireless, China's Huawei is, bidding to become sort of the world's primary provider of that service. And America, is both concerned about the security implications of that and also has unfortunately kind of fallen a step behind in terms of its readiness to bring to market, competitive service. In terms of artificial intelligence, in terms of biotechnology, in both of those fields, there is, growing evidence that China is racing ahead of us. And in part, of course, that's because China is engaging at times in some very unethical medical experiments, and they're not constrained by the democratic moral concerns that constrain some of our biotechnology. So it's a very great concern here, and it's something I think that too many Americans take for granted. We think about all the rest of the world, and we think that we will always have the technological edge that we've had, that we had throughout the 20th century. And it just seems as if it's impossible to believe that other countries could actually succeed in becoming more technologically innovative and pose, both national security risks to us and also the risk of economically leapfrogging us. And yet we see that happening. We see that China really is succeeding in some of these developments. And, it's not that, the Chinese system is invincible. It's not that it's perfect. China is going to, encounter all kinds of political and economic, sort of disruptions of its own over the course of the next decade and more. But there are certain things that they do very well, and they are, able to form long-term plans with a degree of flexibility that you didn't see in places like the Soviet Union, which are, important for strategy. Strategy has to take a long view, whereas, here in the United States, we have, House elections every 2 years where control can shift from one party to another. Setting long-term strategies, both, military and economic, is very difficult to do here. And as a result, the Chinese have a certain edge over us.
Yeah, no, I mean, and the Chinese also have a lot of problems, and maybe too much gets made of this. But they have a lot of their own issues they're going to have to deal with in the future. Population aging, being an aging population, being certainly one of them as well. As not to mention, what are all the problems that come from the ways in which their government spends money within all of these industries and the tremendous debts, I'm told, that are piling up on their account. Thinking also just about the story of middle-class decline, what do you make of culture in this? I mean, I know jobs are a part of it, but what do you make just in general, culturally, what we think of people who don't have work, or our willingness to tolerate that, or to shift blame, et cetera?
Yeah, one of the things I criticize within the essay is what I call palliative liberalism, and this mentality of writing off large, millions of Americans as basically useless. And, there's a sense in which they're useless because they are sort of moral invalids of some kind. You saw this with in various different ways with Hillary Clinton, with Barack Obama, and with Mitt Romney. So Barack Obama talks about people who are bitterly clinging to their guns in Pennsylvania. Hillary Clinton talks about, how Trump supporters are deplorables. And Mitt Romney, says in an unscripted moment during a fundraiser that 47% of Americans are basically not job creators. They're people who are, in some way dependent upon or look towards government and therefore will never vote for Republicans. All of this amounts to basically saying that there is, simply a large, useless or sort of politically backward element within America that simply has to be, tolerated, maybe, sort of kept, on opioids or generally kept from causing trouble, but they're really not going to be they're not going to be a dynamic force in the rest of this century. And, the best thing you can say for them, people like Kevin Williamson say, well, what they should be doing is they should be moving to the cities. The trouble with that, however, it's actually the case right now that American mobility, people moving from one place to another for jobs, is historically quite low. It's rather the opposite of what, some of my localist friends think. My localist friends think that people are abandoning their hometowns and they're going to live, everywhere else. But it's actually less the case than has historically been so in America. But the implications of that are rather different from what either Kevin Williamson or my localist friends would think. People were more mobile before because they had places to go to. They had, jobs that they could and sort of burgeoning new fields in which they could get into. Right now, they are less mobile because they see less reason to move for a job or for new opportunities. And you can see how hard it would be to go from a post-industrial city or a place stricken by methamphetamines or opioids, and to go to a city like New York or a city like San Francisco and try to get your feet on the first few rungs of the economic ladder. It's just not that easy to go in and become a software programmer. You can go in and become an Uber driver or something, but that's not much of an aspiration for most people.
Thinking about, and Dan, me, I'm no elite. But when I think about my experiences, and right now here I live in Indianapolis, a storyline that's gone out around the city is there are more job openings than there are employers fear people to fill them. Now, we can say maybe those aren't jobs making 50,000 a year. I assume they're not. But that's an interesting statistic. I think of where I've lived. Now, I've lived mostly in red places. I went to law school in the Research Triangle of North Carolina. Booming economy, still to this, even more so now as recently there. I practice law in Nashville, Tennessee. Booming city, 100 people a day, I'm told, moving in. It seems to me like when we look in those places, things are actually pretty good. And in effect, maybe one of the best things that Trump has done is, this state and local tax deductibility on your income taxes, which actually forces up the competitive federalism between places like Chicago or a Nashville or San Antonio, Texas, or a Los Angeles versus, a large Charlotte, North Carolina, for instance. It seems to me that's actually a very positive thing, and there are many opportunities available there. What do you say to that?
Oh, I agree, and I agree that Donald Trump's tax cuts have been, one of the things that have driven that, and his change in tax policy, getting rid of, state and local tax deductibility. That's been a wonderful idea. It was one of the best things in the recent tax bill, and even simply the fact that workers have more money in their paychecks as a result of the Donald Trump tax cut. That too is doing great things. No, I think across the board, Trump's policies have actually been very good. Not just in terms of fostering employment, but right now we see actually that American wages are rising, which is something that people for some time had kind of given up on. They thought that there was never a chance that American wages would start rising. I think some of this is a result not just of policies that Trump has already enacted, but in some ways of policies that he has signaled. I mean, it's very clear that Donald Trump takes a much stricter view of immigration, and therefore, sort of deters preemptively a degree of immigration. You could almost call it preemptive self-deportation, you might call it if you were Mitt Romney, simply, sort of not wanting to try to break into the U.S. when it's, not going to be easy to do so. I think all of that, sends signals that, American workers should have confidence that the laws of the country are going to support them, in terms of offering them opportunities, the way that, the Whigs and Lincoln had imagined. And American businesses also see, hey, wait a minute, if we hire American workers, things will be going well for us. We have the, sort of capital as a result of some of these, tax cuts to do more hiring. So yes, I think, even what Donald Trump has achieved so far is, sort of moving things in the right direction. Now, I would say, yes, of course, there are places like the Research Triangle in North Carolina that are doing quite well. If you look, however, at the way in which American jobs are being restructured, and you look at the sectors of the economy that are growing most quickly in terms of jobs added, percentage-wise, some of it's a little bit troubling. So, education is growing. Again, I think a lot of that is probably is administrators rather than teachers. Healthcare is growing, which is, partly to be expected with an aging population, but it also seems as if, unless it's research, most healthcare is not really going to be something that continues to generate further future returns. It's rather something that's simply dealing with our aging population. It's generally not that people are being hired in enormous numbers by places like the Research Triangles. They are being hired in significant numbers, but it's not the kind of thing that's going to sort of lift the entire country.
Well, I mean, it's interesting here too. We talk about education and healthcare, two sectors you list. Those are enormously distorted, in my opinion, by government. Government policies at multiple levels have changed the way people are going to work, have changed the way the price of those goods and services that you're going to have access to. I think in healthcare, you don't even have a reliable price system to begin with. You have something incredibly distorted by, insurance, employer insurance policies for one, Medicare for one, Medicaid for one, government being involved in the provision of services. Education, the problems are legion there. There's, the inkling of a competitive system, but particularly at the primary and secondary level, all of which goes back to sort of my perennial conservative concerns and ideas when I think about trying to separate as best one can government from institutions I think should be of a civil society nature, and I would actually include healthcare and education within that. It seems to me, just thinking about these problems that you list, and the reason why I asked the culture question is I just wonder in general, particularly thinking about young men who don't have work. And there's a tremendous debate that I can make out between who are actually the young men who don't want to work versus those who have chosen to do other things. And then, how does the welfare state kind of come in and compensate for that and make it possible in some measure to not have a job? Thinking, I'm from a really gross, knuckle dragging red state, according to progressive thinkers, Tennessee. Tennessee completely subsidizes the cost of community college. Those are jobs, but they tend to produce people who are plugged directly into the local economy with work upon graduation. Seems to me if one seeks it, I continue to think it's there. It requires discipline. It requires a lot of virtue, frugality. Don't get into credit card debt. A lot of other, I think, personal problems in our culture. Seems to me they're there. And so I guess at the end of the day, as I read your article and others, I'm still having a hard time being convinced that we're in this period of middle class economic decline that is so pervasive.
Well, first of all, I guess I would say, obviously everyone has to form his own impression from looking at, the world as he's experienced it, looking at the communities he's come from, looking at, Indianapolis, which has been a success story for, some 20 years or so, since sort of the mid-1990s. It really turned itself around very successfully. So on the one hand, there's the evidence of your own eyes, which I'm not saying you should discount. Mm. On the other hand, there's also the evidence of the way in which the American people are reacting to the changes that they've experienced. And I would say that you can't really discount that evidence either. It seems to me that, the fact that you have someone like Donald Trump running on a policy of economic nationalism against all of the sort of orthodox conservatives who had been his competitors back in the 2016 primaries, that's an indication that the American people are losing faith in, the economic orthodoxy of what conservatives have been calling, the free market. And then, of course, if you look over to the Democrats, now it's, been the case for a long time, of course, that Democrats have been statists. They've often been statists who've, had a kind of gloss or a veneer of, sort of high-tech capitalism and, sort of policies that are good for Wall Street, as well as policies that are, directed towards providing welfare. That was the formula that, Bill Clinton had come up with, and then the Democrats after him tried to provide. But now we see Democrats actually moving rather hard in a, socialist, a social democratic direction with Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, et cetera. So all of that suggests that, there really is a feeling, you as an individual might have a feeling that things are just great and, anyone who wants to succeed can still succeed. But obviously the way that people are behaving politically right now suggests that a lot of people don't feel the way that you feel. Now, I should speak to this point about culture and these, various fields that have been distorted by government. This goes back to my original point about what kind of economic vision Americans have and what's necessary to accomplish that vision. So right now, we have created this economic vision, and it's one actually that many conservatives as well as many on the left endorse, which basically says that higher education is a solution to almost any problem, and that, in order to be middle class, in order to have the jobs of the future, you have to go to a 4-year college. You have to take on the debt that government will provide for you, or that, sort of lenders that are subsidized or insured by government will provide. You're going to, come out of college. You can study, oppression studies. You can study, whatever you want to do in college. But somehow having that, degree, that credential, is going to open a pathway to you for a productive job. And this is one of the things I think where there's a bit of a disjunction between what conservatives are saying these days. Because on the one hand, some conservatives have reached the point where they say, you know what, it would actually be better if people got more vocational training, if people didn't go into these 4-year, universities and colleges, if instead they were able to enter the workforce earlier. But if you ask yourself what kinds of jobs are available if you don't have a college degree, what kind of jobs pay well, the answer historically has been manufacturing jobs, and those are ones that we're losing right now. So, people say, well, if everyone became a plumber, then they'd be making great wages. But of course, you have, plumbing is a great job. It's a good blue-collar job, but it's a job that there's only so much demand for. And if you have more people moving into plumbing, that's going to lower plumbing wages. So part of the problem here is this entire vision of what a technologically advanced, highly educated workforce is meant to be doing and is meant to have as both its educational background and its professional economic destiny. It seems to me all of that has been badly distorted, again, not only by our own government policies, but also by the policies that other countries have pursued to emphasize industry over getting a paper credential for whatever education you might have.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I was reading the other day, something like 20% of American high school students will actually graduate from a 4-year degree program within 5 years of graduating high school. And yet that's where we're putting all of our resources. It seems to me when we think about our high school students. So we should rethink that. Yeah, and I agree with that completely. It seems to me, so I guess one question that I have, though, is if industrial jobs have been declining, and that seems to be where you're putting a lot of your emphasis, is it realistic to think we could rebuild that?
Oh, absolutely. Again, as I say, it's not as if we have reached a point on planet Earth where people no longer want to buy goods, where people no longer want to have, sort of well-made products. The question is, can American industry be competitive? And is American industry, and when I say be competitive, I mean, relatively speaking. It's not just that our output has to be competitive, which it presently is, but the question is, can our output be competitive relative to the growth trends that we see in places like China? So can we, take this world market that is growing very rapidly, and can we grow as rapidly as that market in order to serve it? Or are we sort of content to rest on the degree of manufacturing that we have right now? It seems to me we should be expanding rapidly as opposed to simply maximizing our output of what we have right now. And some of this, by the way, involves very long-term investments. So with the steel industry, for example, I think building an industrial forge costs something close to $1 billion, and just maintaining it, over the course of a decade, and I think it runs continuously over a decade, costs something like, $100 million over the course of a few years. It's just an enormous capital investment, which is why when these, massive industrial forges shut down as a result of China, sort of subsidizing their steel production, it's very hard to reacquire that lost capacity. And, I hear various libertarians sometimes say, well, it's wonderful that America's sort of downstream manufacturers are able to get this cheap steel from China. Well, you're able to get it now because China is subsidizing it, but ultimately you don't want China to have the sort of chokehold on that kind of production, and you don't want them to have control over the pricing in the long run. And if your own capacity has been decimated and is very hard to restore, that's when you give the People's Republic of China quite a good deal of leverage. So all of these things are, sort of need to be priced into our political calculations and our economic calculations as we look at what's happening in the American economy.
Well, I'll say the other side, though, of the argument is comparative advantage. And if we've ceased to be competitive to compete efficiently with the rest of the world in certain economic sectors, what's going to be the cost to a broad range of Americans of trying to use government to make that happen? I mean, in effect, you are going to force, I think, a much greater number of workers to bear the cost of all these jobs you're going to create or save through some type of government intervention.
Well, I disagree with your whole premise about government intervention. It's not the case right now, for example, that the United States doesn't have an industrial policy. We actually do have an industrial policy. That policy is made in Beijing. So it's not the case that we are operating in a market that is not distorted by government activities. It's simply not our government that's sort of involved in all of the distortions. Or actually, our government is involved in the distortions, but it's doing so as a sort of cooperator with the People's Republic of China, and also with Japan, and with any number of other countries that have had quite well-defined industrial policies and that are happy to take advantage of our financial elite's preference for consumerism over any kind of production. What was your original question there?
Well, no, just comparative advantage. If we're going to try and build up Americans in sectors that we've ceased to compete efficiently in, a lot of other people bear the cost of that. I mean, who's bearing the cost of the tariffs right now that we've imposed on China? It's created steel jobs, but it's also negatively impacted millions of other jobs. So that's all right. That is saying that has to be kept in mind. I don't think you can just easily dismiss that.
No, that's right. It has to be kept in mind, and it has to be kept in mind in the long run as well. So right now, we've actually seen that the current account deficit has gone up quite significantly since Donald Trump began talking about his tariffs. Now, in part, that is because a lot of, Well, booming economy, but also, a lot of foreign producers are very eager to, get to market right now in America because they're afraid that there are going to be, sort of restrictions on them in the future. So they are effectively, dumping is the crude way to put it, but they are rushing to market everything they possibly can right now, which is going to, create that, exacerbate that current deficit difficulty. But no, you're right. I mean, one of the questions that, people often put out here is, if you look at just the accounting books, you might say that in raw number terms, there is more harm being done sometimes than good in terms of, okay, so you have a certain number of jobs that may have been saved in the steel industry, but on the other hand, consumers may now be paying more for a variety of goods. And when you aggregate the numbers, you find that the amount that consumers are now paying may outstrip the amount of income that those workers are getting. The difficulty with that is that distribution effects actually do matter, right? So if you imagine a situation where you have a sort of coercive blood bank that's able to, sort of go out there and demand blood for people. If it demands, a gallon of blood from to be taken in piecemeal fashion from, 100 different people, that's terrible. But of course, it's something you can survive. Whereas if it takes all of that blood, or even, 3/4 of that blood, all from one individual, that one individual is likely to be dead. The distribution effect is important for the quality that people experience in the economy. It's not just a matter of the raw numbers. But in the long run, I think what you're going to see is as America, tries to become an export economy again, as it focuses on serving not only our own market, but also world markets better and creating products that people want to buy overseas, you're going to see a great deal of benefit for the American consumer as well as the American producer. And historically, that has been the case. It was true in the 19th century. It was true in the 20th century. Those were great times not only for American productive capacity and for American industrial workers, those were also wonderful times for American consumers.
Yeah, so just anecdotally, I thought this was interesting. I was recently in Washington, spoke with a lawyer representing manufacturers to the Trump administration in these ongoing China negotiations. His contention is many of his clients are really losing a lot of what they gained in the corporate income tax cuts through the tariffs. That's worth thinking about. Also, we talk about being able to be an export economy. My understanding is our service sector is an export economy.
Yeah, our service sector is, exporting, and so is our manufacturing to some degree. But overall, we are not keeping pace with the growth of world, demand for goods. And that's something I think that we can actually do a better job of keeping pace with. As far as the service sector is concerned, part of the problem here is that the service sector really consists of a lot of heterogeneous elements. There's a part of the service sector which I think is basically in many ways equivalent to manufacturing. So if you're a software engineer and the products you're creating are virtual products as opposed to, sort of hard material goods, it seems to me that is still, doing the same kind of thing that's involved in manufacturing. And that's still sort of well-paid work that is creating a product that people actually want to buy, that goes to market and that has to compete. If you are in the lower levels of the service sector, things like retail and warehouse work, a lot of fields that are booming right now, that is, necessary work within an economy, and that's always a large part of a modern economy, simply because, retail is something that's, pretty much everywhere, or warehouse work is going to be everywhere if you're going to have things like Amazon. But it's very hard to get ahead structurally based on that kind of service sector work. But then there are other kinds of service sector work that are, I think, quite corrosive. There is actually a kind of mirroring effect whereby government regulation and even the sort of culture and ethos that government creates wind up being replicated in the private sector and become a growing part of that private sector because of sort of bureaucratic self-dealing. And this is what I think we see right now to a very worrying extent with the rise of, not only compliance costs and the service departments that have to be created in order to comply with government regulations, but also with the expansion of, HR departments, which are now pursuing various kinds of politically correct agendas that are sometimes sometimes they are directly dictated by government, and sometimes they're simply dictated by government in a kind of roundabout way through the educational inculcation that these HR officers receive in the universities.
So let me just ask you this question, and maybe we can end. So generally speaking, though, would you fear the same sorts of things happening, though, with a direct nexus between government, industrial policy, and the manufacturing sector? That is, it itself would become distorted by measures that are meant to help it.
There are distortions anytime you have government and business involved together. The question is whether you have certain kinds of responsive actions that are necessary to correct for other distortions that have been created elsewhere down the line, right? So if finance is looking to advance itself through a trade policy that is very bad, for industry, then the question becomes, does industry also need some sort of defensive mechanism with regard to our finance sector and with regard to the foreign manufacturers with whom our finance sector is quite happily in bed? Now, this actually takes us back to the point at which we started, which is Wilmore Kendall. Wilmore Kendall was not afraid of the clash of interests, just as James Madison wasn't. He saw the American Congress, the legislature, as being a proper place for deliberation between all of these interests and, deliberation by statesmen who would take account of the interests within their areas, within their states and localities, and would, they would hear from lobbyists, they would hear from citizens, and they would try to negotiate all of these interests and come up with, just as Donald Trump likes to do, try to come up with some sort of solution that is obviously not perfect, but that it has been negotiated in such a way that it doesn't leave what Wilmore Kendall used to call an unconcluded minority, basically a minority that has been left embittered and alienated from the body politic. It seems to me that going back to that Wilmore Kendall vision of politics and deliberation and negotiation and not just, sort of dogma is very, very important. And one of the problems that we've had more recently is that across the board, both the left and the right have been moving away from that kind of deliberation towards, on the one hand, a more executive-based, Caesaristic kind of approach, and also towards a more administrative and bureaucratic approach to making laws. And that includes with free trade, of course, where free trade agreements generally are not able to be viewed by the public while they're being negotiated by the expert bureaucrats who come up with the text. That's a problem for political legitimacy, quite apart from the problems it may pose in terms of, whose interests are being served or not served by the agreement itself. Now, Congress, of course, has ceded a lot of its powers, not just in...
No, that was my response. Yeah, I was thinking, I agree with what Wilmore Kendall said, and that's the best solution, although given our constitutional order, but all the major contentious disputes tend to be decided either by the president through an executive order, increasingly. So, or the Supreme Court. Yeah.
And that's because Congress itself has decided it prefers things that way, because Congress doesn't want to be subjected to, angry steel manufacturers within their own districts. They would much rather say, well, it's all the president's decision, let him do it. And until now, they've had presidents who they've relied upon to be pursuing a kind of liberal trade policy. And now they have Donald Trump, and suddenly they realize, wait a minute, they are getting something they hadn't bargained for. But I still would guess that they actually are not very serious about wanting to take back their deliberative and legislating and governing function, and that they are reluctant to do that because it just puts too much pressure on them as an institution. There's an argument to be made that, in fact, the closest thing to Wilmore Kendall's vision that can now be achieved is actually to, give a larger role to the president, simply because that's the way the formation of our system has taken us over time, that there really is no going back. Now, sometimes I'm not, willing to concede that much. Leads to a really
contentious politics, yeah.
Yeah, and then it makes, of course, these presidential elections as close and contentious as they have been for the last several cycles.
Daniel McCarthy, thank you so much for joining us. We've been talking with Dan about his new essay, A New Conservative Agenda, which you can find in the March edition of First Things. I appreciate it so much.
Thanks, Richard.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.